The crystal chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom cast a warm glow over the pre-wedding celebration, their light catching the subtle silver threads in Dr. Noel Gilbert's perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit. At 52, he cut an impressive figure, tall, distinguished, with steel gray hair and the confident bearing of a man who held lives in his hands daily. As Mount Sinai's top cardiac surgeon, he'd saved countless lives, but tonight was about a different kind of achievement, his daughter Bridget's wedding. He surveyed the room with quiet satisfaction, noting how the elaborate flower arrangements, white orchids and blush roses, complemented the venue's Beaux Arts architecture. Each detail of tomorrow's million-dollar wedding represented careful planning and years of dedicated savings. The guest list read like a who's who of New York's medical elite, with hospital board members mingling among society figures. Champagne, Dr. Gilbert. A waiter appeared at his elbow with a tray of crystal flutes. Thank you. Noel accepted the glass, taking a measured sip as he watched his wife Lorraine work the room. At 48, she still turned heads in her burgundy Vera wine gown, her blonde hair styled in elegant waves. She laughed at something Alexander Chun, the hospital's chief of surgery, had said, touching his arm with practiced charm. Their younger children, Jillian and Rai, had inherited their mother's social grace. Jillian, 23 and in her first year of medical school, captivated a group of young doctors with animated gestures as she discussed her latest rotation. Rai, 19 and home from his freshman year at Yale, had somehow gathered a small crowd of admiring young women, despite his sister being the center of attention. Daddy. Bridget's voice cut through his observations. His eldest daughter approached, resplendent in a white Oscar de la Renta cocktail dress, her engagement ring catching the light. The string quartet is about to take their break. Should we have the DJ start setting up? Noel checked his Patek Philippe watch, a gift from a grateful patient whose heart he'd reconstructed after a devastating accident. Perfect timing, Princess. Have Thomas coordinate with them. You've thought of everything. Bridget beamed, reaching up to straighten his tie. I can't believe tomorrow's finally happening. Blake's parents are over the moon with all the arrangements. Speaking of Blake, where is my future son-in-law? Trapped in conversation with Uncle Eduardo's wife about medical malpractice insurance, Bridget rolled her eyes. I should probably rescue him. The mention of Eduardo made Noel glance toward the ballroom's entrance. His best friend of 25 years was uncharacteristically late, though that wasn't entirely surprising. Eduardo had always had a flair for dramatic entrances, a trait that sometimes irritated their more conservative colleagues, but had never bothered Noel. After all, you had to forgive certain eccentricities in a man who'd stood by you through everything from celebrating career milestones to supporting you through recovery after surgery. As if summoned by the thought, Eduardo swept into the ballroom. At 54, he wore his years with Mediterranean flamboyance, dark hair artfully styled to hide the gray, his custom Italian suit emphasizing his trim physique. He caught Noel's eye across the room and raised a hand in greeting. There's my favorite cardiac cowboy, Eduardo's voice carried as he approached, drawing smiles from nearby guests used to his theatrical manner. He embraced Noel warmly, clapping him on the back. Sorry I'm late. Had a complicated consultation that ran over. You're just in time for Blake's father's toast, Noel replied, noting a peculiar tension in his friend's smile. When Lorraine approached to greet him, Eduardo's hand lingered slightly too long on Lorraine's waist as he stepped back. Though something about their interaction struck a discordant note in Noel's mind, Blake's father was calling for attention, a crystal knife tapping against his champagne flute. If I could have everyone's attention. William Preston II, managing partner at one of Manhattan's top law firms, stood on the small stage where the string quartet had been playing. I'd like to propose a toast to our children and to the incredible family we're about to join. Noel moved to stand beside his daughter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder as William continued. When Blake first told us about Bridget, Caroline, and I knew she was special, a brilliant young woman following in her father's footsteps at Mount Sinai, with a heart as talented as her surgical skills. But meeting Noel and Lorraine Gilbert truly showed us where she got her exceptional qualities. The speech continued, hitting all the right notes about family, tradition, and future promise. Noel smiled at the appropriate moments, but his attention was drawn to a subtle exchange between his wife and Eduardo. A barely noticeable look passed between them as William mentioned family values. Eduardo's hand twitched slightly toward Lorraine before he caught himself. And so, William was concluding, to Blake and Bridget, and the joining of our families. May tomorrow be the start of a lifetime of joy and truth. To Blake and Bridget. The crowd echoed, raising their glasses as the celebration resumed its flow. Noel excused himself to check on last-minute details for tomorrow's ceremony. The plaza's wedding coordinator had messaged about final confirmation of the morning's delivery schedule. The curved hallway leading to the business center was quieter, the sounds of the party fading with each step. Noel had just finished reviewing the schedule when voices from a nearby alcove caught his attention. Years of performing intricate surgeries had trained his ears to catch subtle sounds, a vital skill when listening for the slightest irregularity in a heartbeat. The old fool outdid himself with this wedding. His wife's voice, pitched low but clear. $1 million for his princess. Eduardo's distinctive accent. Noel froze mid-step, his hand resting on the rich wooden paneling of the hallway. He always did have expensive taste, Eduardo replied. Remember when we convinced him the vasectomy worked? That was your masterstroke, memoir. A soft laugh from Lorraine. All three are yours, and now he's paid for this $1 million wedding, too. The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis, but Noel's surgeon's steadiness kept him perfectly still, his breathing controlled and silent. Dad's such a fool, Bridget's voice, now containing none of the warmth she'd shown minutes earlier. At least biological Dad will be walking me down the aisle tomorrow, too. Keep your voice down, Querida. Eduardo's tone was amused rather than concerned. Though I doubt he'd hear us over that horrible string quartet he insisted on. I still can't believe he never questioned why none of the kids look like him, Jillian added, her voice dripping with derision. I mean, we all have Eduardo's eyes. Your father sees what he wants to see, Lorraine replied. It's what makes him such a brilliant surgeon, and such a terrible judge of character. He's so focused on the heart, he misses everything else. The monthly deposits are set for the kids. Eduardo asked, his tone shifting to business-like efficiency. Same as always, Lorraine confirmed, disguised as your academic mentoring payments. He never even glances at those transactions. Blake's family bought the whole mentor story too, Bridget added. They think it's so wonderful that Dad's best friend took such an interest in our education. The conversation shifted to tomorrow's arrangements. But Noel had heard enough. He moved silently back toward the business center, his mind already categorizing and analyzing information with the same precision he used in surgery. 20 minutes later, he sat in the business center's private office, his laptop open to his banking dashboard. The room's modern minimalism, all clean lines and subtle lighting, matched his current state of mind. His hands, steady as ever, moved over the keyboard as he accessed years of financial records. There they were, regular transfers from Eduardo Knopp to his children's accounts dating back to their births. Quarterly payments labeled Academic Mentoring Program, Mount Sinai Initiative. The amounts increased as each child aged, with substantial bumps during college years. His first call was to James Chun, his lawyer and Alexander's brother. James, I need you to execute Protocol Lazarus immediately. Yes, the full package we discussed last year. No, this isn't a drill. The second call went to Sarah Winters, a private investigator he'd retained after noticing discrepancies in his children's medical histories, a precaution he had dismissed as professional paranoia at the time. Ms. Winters, the surveillance package we discussed. I need everything you have on Eduardo Knopp and my wife, going back 25 years. Priority status. The final call was to his banker in Dublin, where he'd established citizenship 3 years ago after treating Ireland's Minister of Health, a precaution that had seemed excessive at the time. Mr. O'Connor, initiate the transfer sequence we prepared, full spectrum, effective immediately. By midnight, the full scope of the betrayal lay documented in folders on his laptop. Eduardo, as head of Mount Sinai's vasectomy clinic, had falsified his procedure records. DNA test results ordered under the guise of routine medical screening confirmed Eduardo's paternity of all 3 children. Bank records showed a complex web of payments and accounts linking his family to his supposed best friend. The Plaza Business Center had emptied hours ago. In the distance, he could hear the last guests departing the pre-wedding celebration. His phone buzzed with a text from Lorraine. "Coming up soon. Everyone's asking where you disappeared to." Noel closed his laptop, sliding it into its leather case with deliberate care. In the morning, he would demonstrate what 25 years of precision surgery had taught him about removing diseased tissue from otherwise healthy systems. Tomorrow's ceremony would indeed mark a new beginning, just not the one they were expecting. He texted back, "Had to handle some last-minute details. Everything is prepared for tomorrow." It wasn't a lie. Dr. Noel Gilbert had never been more prepared in his life. When he returned to their hotel suite, Lorraine was already in bed, scrolling through photos from the evening on her phone. She looked up as he entered, her smile practiced and perfect. "There you are, darling. I was starting to worry." "Just ensuring tomorrow goes smoothly," he replied, his voice pleasant and controlled. "Everything's taken care of." "You've always been so detail-oriented," she murmured, reaching for him as he passed the bed. "It's one of the things I love about you." Noel moved just slightly out of reach, maintaining his smile. "Big day tomorrow. Better get some rest." In the bathroom, he took longer than usual with his evening routine, studying his reflection in the mirror. The face that looked back at him was unchanged, distinguished features, clear gray eyes, the same steady gaze that had guided him through countless surgeries. But behind that familiar facade, something had shifted fundamentally. He thought about the moment in surgery when you finally locate the source of a problem. A blocked artery, a failing valve, a tumor hidden behind healthy tissue. That moment of clarity when you knew exactly what needed to be done. This was such a moment. When he finally slipped into bed, Lorraine was already asleep, her breathing deep and regular. In a few hours, she would wake to discover the true cost of her decades of deception. But for now, Dr. Noel Gilbert closed his eyes, his mind already moving through tomorrow's procedures with icy precision. The night passed quietly, the plaza's thick walls muffling the constant rhythm of the city below. In their separate rooms down the hall, his children, Eduardo's children, slept peacefully, dreaming of tomorrow's celebration, none of them aware that the greatest performance of their lives had just reached its final act. In the darkness, Noel allowed himself a small smile. Tomorrow would indeed be memorable, just not in the way they planned. Dawn broke over Manhattan, painting St. Patrick's Cathedral in shades of rose and gold. At precisely 6:45 a.m., the first of the wedding staff arrived to find printed notices affixed to the heavy wooden doors. The cathedral's head coordinator, Maria Santos, quickly scanned the elegant cardstock. "The wedding of Bridget Gilbert and Blake Preston has been cancelled. Our sincerest apologies for the inconvenience." "This must be a mistake," Maria muttered, reaching for her phone to call Dr. Gilbert. The call went straight to voicemail. By 7:00 a.m., guests began arriving in their finest attire, only to be greeted by ushers distributing small ivory gift boxes, the wedding favors meant for the reception. Inside each box, nestled beneath traditional Jordan almonds, lay a USB drive and a carefully printed letter. William Preston II, still adjusting his bow tie as he climbed the cathedral steps, was among the first to open his. His face paled as he read, fingers tightening on the expensive paper. "My God," he whispered, showing the contents to his wife, Caroline. The USB drive contained meticulously organized folders. DNA test results, bank statements, medical records, and surveillance photos spanning 2 decades. Inside the Prestontown car, Blake scrolled through the documents on his laptop, his expression hardening. "They knew," he said quietly. "Bridget and her entire family knew they were deceiving us. Look at these messages. She's been calling Eduardo Dad in private for years." The cathedral steps became a tableau of shocked faces and hushed conversations as more guests discovered the truth. Hospital board members huddled in groups, their expressions grave as they reviewed evidence of Eduardo's medical misconduct. Society matrons who had envied Lorraine's perfect life now whispered behind manicured hands, their schadenfreude barely concealed. At 7:30 a.m., a sleek black Mercedes screeched to a halt outside the cathedral. Lorraine Gilbert emerged, still in her silk robe and slippers, her carefully maintained composure shattered. Eduardo followed close behind, his usual smooth demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "Where is he?" Lorraine demanded, grabbing Maria's arm. "Where's Noel?" "Dr. Gilbert is in the sacristy, Mrs. Gilbert." Maria's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing distaste. "He's been here since 6. They found Noel in the peaceful quiet of the sacristy, dressed impeccably in his morning suit. He stood at a small desk, organizing papers with the same careful precision he used in surgery. "What have you done?" Lorraine's voice shook with rage. "Do you have any idea how many people you've humiliated?" Noel looked up, his expression calm. "Interesting choice of words, Lorraine. Not how could you, or why did you do this, but concern for the humiliation. Always focused on appearances, aren't you?" "This is madness." Eduardo stepped forward, attempting to project authority. "Think about what you're doing to your children." "My children?" Noel's laugh held no humor. "Let's be precise, Eduardo. Precision matters in our profession, doesn't it? They're your children. The DNA results in those wedding favors make that quite clear." He picked up a thick envelope from the desk. "Divorce papers, Lorraine. My lawyer will be here shortly to witness your signature, though I suppose you'll want to read the terms first." Lorraine snatched the envelope, her hands shaking as she read. Her face went from red to white. "This is impossible. You can't have transferred everything. The houses, the accounts." "The beauty of Irish citizenship," Noel interrupted smoothly, "quite useful for protecting assets. I learned that after noticing certain irregularities in the children's medical histories. Genetic markers that didn't quite match up, just little things that most people would miss. But then, attention to detail is crucial in cardiac surgery." Eduardo's facade of confidence cracked. "The board will never believe." "The board already has everything," Noel cut him off, "including records of your creative approach to vasectomy procedures. Tell me, how many other men paid you to fake their surgeries?" The insurance fraud alone should interest the authorities. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the sacristy's ornate windows, they could see Bridget arriving in her wedding dress, Jillian and Rye close behind. Their phones had exploded with messages from guests, driving them from their preparation suites at the plaza in various states of dress. "Daddy!" Bridget burst into the room, her wedding gown trailing behind her. "What are you doing? You can't." "I believe you made it clear last night that I'm not your daddy," Noel replied evenly, "though I admit the performance over the years was impressive. All those Father's Day cards, the tearful talks about wanting to be just like me in medical school. You should have considered acting instead of medicine, Bridget." "You bastard." Jillian spat, her face contorted with rage. "We'll tell everyone how controlling you were, how you—" "By all means." Noel gestured to his phone on the desk. "Social media is quite powerful, though you might want to check your trust fund accounts first." As of midnight, they've been converted to educational trusts with rather strict morality clauses that take a very dim view of long-term deception. Ray, the youngest, had remained silent until now. "You can't prove anything. It's our word against 2 decades of evidence, Noel raised an eyebrow. Bank records showing Eduardo's payments since your births, DNA tests, surveillance photos. The board is particularly interested in the parts about medical fraud. Speaking of which, the sacristy door opened again, admitting James Chun and a severe-looking woman in a designer suit. Dr. Gilbert, the woman nodded curtly. I'm Patricia Knopp, Mount Sinai's legal counsel. She turned to Eduardo, her expression arctic, and soon to be your ex-wife. Eduardo's face went ashen. Patry, I can explain. Save it for the board hearing. She cut him off. And your malpractice insurers, though I doubt they cover deliberate fraud. Now then, James Chun stepped forward, documents in hand. Mrs. Gilbert, shall we discuss the divorce terms? I suggest you sign quickly. The press will be here soon, and I imagine you'd prefer to be gone by then. Lorraine looked wildly around the room, searching for support. She found none. Bridget had sunk onto a wooden chair, her perfect makeup streaked with tears. Jillian stared at her in horror, watching her trust fund balance plummet. Ray simply looked lost. You've destroyed everything, Lorraine whispered, her hands shaking as she accepted the pen from James. No, Lorraine, Noel corrected her gently. You destroyed everything. I'm simply ensuring the consequences land where they belong. As Lorraine signed, Eduardo attempted one last play. The hospital won't risk the scandal. My reputation is. Finished, Patricia interrupted. The board is meeting in an emergency session right now. Dr. Gilbert's resignation letter included quite detailed evidence of your creative medical practices. Several other patients have already come forward. Outside, the gathering crowd of guests had grown, their murmurs carried through the stained glass windows, punctuated by the clicks of press cameras. The story was spreading through Manhattan's medical community like wildfire. What about Blake? Bridget suddenly asked, her voice small. I need to talk to him. To explain. Blake and his family left 20 minutes ago, Noel informed her. Apparently, they take a dim view of being deceived about paternity. William mentioned something about being grateful the prenup hadn't been signed yet. The weight of consequences seemed to finally hit Eduardo. His tan face had gone gray, his usual swagger replaced by nervous fidgeting. The malpractice suits will ruin me, Lorraine. We. Lorraine's laugh was brittle. There is no we. Eduardo, you promised you'd covered your tracks. You said the vasectomy records were perfect. You assured me. Fascinating, Noel commented, watching their alliance crumble. 25 years of deception undone in 25 minutes of pressure. Though I suppose that's often how it goes in surgery too. One small weakness, and everything falls apart. James Chun cleared his throat. Dr. Gilbert, the papers are signed. Shall I file them immediately? Please do. Noel straightened his tie, checking his reflection in the window. I believe my work here is done. You can't just leave. Jillian protested. What about our tuition? Our lives? You owe us. I owed my children everything. Noel corrected her. I owe Eduardo's children nothing, though the educational trusts remain active if you choose to earn them honestly. Consider it a lesson in consequence. He picked up his briefcase, pausing at the door. Oh, and Eduardo, the board might be interested in those other vasectomy cases you handled, the ones for the Wall Street executives. I'm sure their wives would be fascinated to learn about your special service. The sacristy fell silent as Noel departed, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Through the windows, they watched him emerge into the morning sun. Photographers surged forward, but he passed through them with the same calm authority he showed in the operating room. The Mercedes that had brought Lorraine and Eduardo now waited for him instead, his new driver holding the door as he settled into the leather seat. His phone buzzed with a message from the chief of surgery at St. James Hospital in Dublin. Physician ready when you are, Noel. Ireland would be lucky to have you. He smiled slightly, watching his former family's world implode through the tinted windows. The cathedral spires rose against the morning sky, witnesses to a different kind of ceremony than planned. one of truth rather than deception. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving chaos in its wake. Behind him, Eduardo faced his wife's cold fury and the board's investigation, while Lorraine's carefully constructed social world crumbled like a house of cards. Their children, faced with the consequences of their complicity, watched their privileged lives dissolve. But Dr. Noel Gilbert felt only the calm satisfaction of a surgeon after a successful operation, when diseased tissue had been carefully excised, leaving room for healthy growth to begin. His phone buzzed again, a news alert this time. Scandal at Mount Sinai. Top surgeon exposes decades of deception. He turned off the phone, looking ahead to the airport where his private jet waited. Dublin beckoned, offering not an escape, but a carefully planned new beginning. Behind him, Manhattan's medical community would be dealing with the fallout for months to come. None of them would ever forget the wedding that wasn't, or the surgeon who turned his skills for precision and planning toward a different kind of cutting altogether. The morning sun sparkled off the River Liffey, casting diamond patterns on the walls of Dr. Noel Gilbert's penthouse apartment in Dublin's prestigious Docklands district. 1 year had passed since the wedding that wasn't, and Dublin had proved to be more than just an escape. It was a renaissance. Noel stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, reviewing patient files on his tablet while enjoying his morning coffee. The Irish Times lay open on his sleek breakfast bar, featuring his latest cardiac procedure innovation. Dublin's American surgeon pioneers revolutionary valve replacement technique. His phone buzzed with a message from St. James's Hospital's chief of surgery. Board approve your research funding. Full autonomy as requested. They're still celebrating landing Mount Sinai's star surgeon. A satisfied smile crossed his face as he set down the phone. The betrayal had stripped away his naivety but left something more valuable in its place. Clarity. Every surgery, every innovation, every success was now purely his own, with no false family ties or pretended loyalties clouding his judgment. His tablet pinged with a news alert from New York. Mount Sinai scandal update. Former department head faces multiple lawsuits. The attached photo showed Eduardo Knopp leaving a courthouse, his formerly immaculate appearance now haggard. The article detailed the growing number of wealthy patients coming forward about fake vasectomy procedures, each lawsuit adding to the mounting legal fees draining Eduardo's accounts. A second alert followed. Medical board hearing. Nurse's license under review in insurance fraud case. The image showed Lorraine, her carefully maintained beauty fading under stress, avoiding reporters' cameras. Her involvement in Eduardo's scheme had come to light gradually over the past year. She had helped falsify post-operative care records, making it easier for Eduardo to fake the procedures. Noel's personal investigator had been thorough, uncovering how Lorraine had used her position as a nurse to facilitate the fraud. Each revelation had stripped away another layer of her social standing, leaving her increasingly isolated as former friends distanced themselves from the scandal. His intercom buzzed. Dr. Gilbert, your 9:00 a.m. meeting with the research team is ready. Thank you, Claire. He gathered his materials, pausing only briefly to straighten his tie in the reflection of a framed article. Dublin Medical Excellence Award. Dr. Noel Gilbert, recognized for innovative cardiac procedures. The past year had transformed him, but not in the way his betrayers might have expected. There was no bitterness, no consuming rage, only the precise, calculated focus that had made him a brilliant surgeon, now applied to every aspect of his life. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, his former family's carefully constructed world continued to unravel. Bridget sat in her tiny Manhattan studio apartment, staring at her phone. Blake's wedding announcement to his new fiancée filled her screen, a society page feature about the whirlwind romance that had begun shortly after his fortunate escape from a fraudulent engagement. Her attempt to reach out to him had been met with a cease and desist letter from the Preston family lawyers. The prestigious hospital residency she'd been promised had evaporated when the full story emerged. Now she worked locum shifts at urgent care clinics, her dreams of following in either father's footsteps shattered. Across town, Jillian faced her own crisis. She stood outside Mount Sinai Medical School, reading the email for the 100th time. Dear Miss Gilbert, after review of recent events, and in accordance with our morality clause, we regret to inform you that your admission to Mount Sinai School of Medicine has been rescinded. Her carefully planned future, following Noel's path to surgical excellence, had dissolved. The trust fund's morality clause meant she couldn't even afford to apply to lesser schools. Her social media campaign attempting to paint Noel as controlling had backfired spectacularly when his former patients flooded the internet with stories of his compassion and integrity. 20 years of performing life-saving surgeries pro bono for children. One viral post read, Dr. Gilbert gave my daughter a future when no one else would even try, and his own children tried to destroy him with lies. Ray, the youngest, faced the harshest awakening. He sat in the Yale bursar's office, trying to maintain his composure as the administrator delivered the news. I'm sorry, Mr. Gilbert, but without the next semester's tuition payment, we'll have to withdraw your enrollment. My father, Eduardo Knapp, he promised he'd cover it, Ray stammered. Dr. Knapp's office informed us he's unable to provide funding due to ongoing legal issues. The administrator's tone held little sympathy. Perhaps you should contact Dr. Gilbert about reinstating your educational trust. But Ray knew that option came with strings he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The trust's morality clause required a public admission of his role in the deception and a formal apology. His pride, the same pride that had made him participate in mocking the man who'd raised him, now kept him from taking the path to redemption. That evening, in a modest Queen's apartment, Lorraine sorted through past due notices while Eduardo paced, his designer shoes scuffing the worn carpet. The malpractice insurance company's final decision came today. He spat, waving a letter. They're refusing to cover any of it. Deliberate fraud voids the policy. You promised me they'd never find out, Lorraine hissed, her perfectly maintained facade cracking. You said the records were perfect. And you promised your nursing records would back up my procedures. Eduardo shot back. Now look at us. I'm about to lose my license. Your nursing career is under review, and your precious social status is gone. At least I'm not the one facing criminal charges, Lorraine snapped. How many fake vasectomies did you perform? 20? 30. You didn't complain when those fake procedures were funding our children's lifestyles, Eduardo retorted, or when my academic mentoring payments kept you in designer clothes. Their bitter argument was interrupted by a call from their lawyer. More bad news, Eduardo announced after hanging up. 3 more patients have joined the class action lawsuit. Their wives are particularly interested in the fertility clinic records you helped falsify, Lorraine. Her response was cut short by a notification on her phone. Another former friend had publicly unfollowed her on social media. Her carefully curated image as Manhattan's medical elite power couple had crumbled, replaced by whispers and turned backs at every charity event and social gathering she could still access. Back in Dublin, Noel reviewed applications for his department's newest initiative, a medical ethics scholarship focused on integrity in patient care. The irony wasn't lost on him. His former family's betrayal had sparked an initiative that would shape future generations of medical professionals. His assistant interrupted with a message. Dr. Gilbert, Mount Sinai's board sent another offer to have you return as chief of cardiac surgery. Decline it, he replied without hesitation. But send them my latest research paper on ethical guidelines in medical practice. They seem to need it. The sun set over the Liffey, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. In his reflection on the window, Noel saw not a victim of betrayal, but a man who had turned deception into determination, betrayal into breakthrough. Tomorrow would bring new surgeries, new innovations, new chances to save lives. The past was precisely where it belonged, behind him, serving as a foundation for something far more valuable than false family ties, a legacy built on truth. Eduardo Knapp sat in his attorney's office, staring at the mounting stack of lawsuit files. Multiple patients had come forward, each case more damaging than the last. Wealthy businessmen whose wives had become mysteriously pregnant years after their supposed vasectomies were particularly eager to testify. It's not just the medical malpractice, his lawyer explained grimly. The insurance fraud charges alone could carry significant penalties, and with Mrs. Gilbert's nursing license under review for her role in falsifying records. Don't mention that woman to me, Eduardo snapped. The affair that had seemed so exciting, so worth every risk, now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. This is her fault. If she'd been more careful with the documentation. I'd be careful about assigning blame, his lawyer interrupted. The prosecutors are very interested in how long she helped cover up your fake procedures. They're offering her a deal to testify. In another part of the city, Lorraine sat before the nursing board, her designer outfit carefully chosen to project an image of respectability that was rapidly slipping away. Mrs. Gilbert, the board chairman began, or do you prefer Mrs. Knopp now? Gilbert is fine, she replied tightly. The divorce from Noel had been finalized with brutal efficiency, while Eduardo's promises of marriage had evaporated along with his finances. The evidence suggests a pattern of falsifying post-operative records spanning over 15 years. The chairman continued. Each fake vasectomy procedure required nursing documentation. Documentation you provided. Eduardo assured me. Dr. Knapp's assurances are not an issue here, another board member cut in. Your professional integrity is. These men's wives trusted medical professionals to tell them the truth. Instead, you helped perpetrate a fraud that affected not just their health decisions but their entire families. The irony of her role in destroying families wasn't lost on the board. Their decision was unanimous. Nursing license revoked. Meanwhile, the children she'd raised to prize appearance over integrity faced their own reckonings. Bridget's attempt to rebuild her medical career hit another wall as a potential employer checked her references. I'm sorry, Miss Gilbert, the HR director said, but we can't risk our clinic's reputation. Your involvement in the Mount Sinai scandal is too well documented. I was just a child when it started, Bridget protested. I didn't understand. You were 26 when you planned to have both men walk you down the aisle, the director reminded her. Your social media posts mocking Dr. Gilbert's ignorance of your paternity suggest you understood perfectly well. Jillian's social media campaign had become a case study in backfiring attempts at reputation management. Her posts calling Noel controlling and emotionally abusive had prompted an outpouring of support for him. Former patients shared stories of his compassion. Nurses and residents detailed his mentorship. Charitable organizations revealed decades of pro bono work he'd never publicized. Each testimony painted a picture of a man who had given everything to a family that had mocked his generosity behind his back. Ray, the youngest, faced perhaps the cruelest realization. Sitting in a campus coffee shop, he watched Eduardo brush past without acknowledging him. But you said you'd help with tuition, Ray had pleaded earlier that day. You're my father. I'm being sued by half of Manhattan's elite, Eduardo had snapped. My assets are frozen, my career is over, and your mother's demands are endless. I can't afford another mouth to feed. The casual dismissal hurt worse than Noel's calculated departure. Noel, at least, had left them a path to redemption through the educational trusts. Eduardo offered nothing but excuses. That evening in her Queens apartment, the great love affair that had destroyed so many lives ended not with passion but with pettiness. Your son came begging for money today, Eduardo told Lorraine. Our son, she corrected. No, yours, he replied. I'm done pretending. Look where it got us. I had a reputation, a career, respect. Now what do I have? A one-bedroom apartment and a woman who can't even nurse anymore. At least I'm not facing jail time, Lorraine shot back. How many years do they give for medical fraud these days? Their argument was interrupted by a news alert. Dublin Medical Innovation makes headlines. Dr. Noel Gilbert's revolutionary procedure saves child's life. The silence that followed was deafening. 5 years after the wedding that wasn't, Boston's Medical Innovation Conference buzzed with anticipation. Dr. Noel Gilbert's keynote address on his revolutionary valve replacement procedure had drawn professionals from around the world. In the hospital corridor afterward, he encountered a familiar face. Ray, older and humbled, wearing orderly scrubs as he pushed a supply cart. "Dr. Gilbert." Ray's voice was uncertain. "I'm working here, while taking community college classes." Noel studied the young man who had once been his youngest child. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like understanding. "The trust is still active," Noel said simply, "when you're ready to earn it honestly." "I know," Ray replied. That's actually why I'm here, working as an orderly, seeing what real medical professionals do, how they care for patients. I understand now what you tried to teach us about integrity." Noel's response was measured. Understanding is the first step. Actions determine the rest. Their brief conversation was interrupted by a nurse calling for Ray's assistance. As he watched his former son push the supply cart away, Noel reflected on the changes 5 years had brought. In a small Queens apartment, Lorraine and Eduardo's great love affair had devolved into mutual recrimination. Their attempts to rebuild their careers had failed. No hospital would risk hiring professionals with their history of fraud. "It's your fault" had become their daily refrain to each other. "You promised we wouldn't get caught." But while they descended into bitterness, Noel had risen higher. His Dublin practice had revolutionized cardiac care. His research papers were required reading in medical schools. His newest initiative, the Gilbert Medical Ethics Scholarship, was shaping a new generation of doctors who understood that integrity wasn't just a word, it was the foundation of medicine itself. "The scholarship interview panel is ready," his assistant reminded him as he returned to the conference. The candidates were promising young medical students who had demonstrated not just academic excellence, but ethical integrity in challenging situations. Each interview included a case study of medical fraud and its consequences. Some recognized the case as his own story, though he never confirmed it. The lesson was what mattered. Integrity, once broken, commanded a price no amount of deception could avoid. That evening, as he prepared for dinner with Dr. Sarah Collins, a fellow surgeon whose honesty had caught his attention months ago, Noel received one final email. It was from Ray, sent hours after their hallway encounter. "Dear Dr. Gilbert, today reminded me of something you once said in the OR. Every heart has a rhythm of truth. Our job is to listen for it. I didn't understand then. I do now." Noel smiled slightly as he closed his laptop. The betrayal that had ended one chapter of his life had opened another one built on truth, innovation, and a legacy that would outlast any deception. In the end, the greatest triumph was not in dismantling his betrayers, but in creating something far more lasting and valuable. 10 years later, the Manhattan courthouse stood imposing against the autumn sky, as Eduardo Knapp shuffled through its doors, a shadow of his former self. At 64, his Mediterranean charm had faded to gray, his once proud posture bent under the weight of a decade's consequences. Today marked the final hearing in a class action lawsuit that had taken years to resolve. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Martinez entered the courtroom. Eduardo's public defender, now all he could afford, straightened his wrinkled tie. The gallery behind them filled with familiar faces, former patients whose lives his deception had upended, their families seeking closure, and reporters eager to document the final fall of Mount Sinai's once prestigious doctor. "In the matter of Collins et al. Versus Knapp," Judge Martinez began, "this court has reviewed the settlement terms. The defendant's remaining assets will be distributed among the victims of his medical fraud scheme. Mr. Knapp, do you understand these terms?" "Yes, Your Honor." Eduardo's voice cracked. The settlement would take everything, his savings, his pension, even the small Queens apartment he'd managed to keep until now. In the gallery's back row, Lorraine Gilbert. She'd never legally changed her name, though Eduardo had promised marriage for years, watched with bitter resignation. At 58, her carefully maintained appearance had crumbled under financial strain. The designer clothes were long gone, replaced by discount store finds. Her blonde hair, now streaked with gray, hadn't seen a professional stylist in years. Furthermore, the judge continued, the defendant is permanently barred from any medical practice or consultation, including overseas opportunities. That final stipulation crushed Eduardo's last hope. He'd been negotiating with a questionable clinic in South America, promising them his special services. Now, even that door closed. After the hearing, Lorraine didn't wait for him. Their great love affair had devolved into a bitter coexistence in their cramped apartment, each blaming the other for their downfall. Tonight, she would return to her job as a receptionist at a strip mall dental office, the only medical-adjacent work she could find after losing her nursing license. The next morning's Irish Times carried a vastly different story. The headline read, Gilbert Medical Ethics Foundation expands global reach. The accompanying photo showed Dr. Noel Gilbert, distinguished at 62, speaking at Trinity College Dublin's medical school. The article detailed his latest triumph, a worldwide initiative combining innovative cardiac procedures with stringent ethical oversight. His valve replacement technique had become the global standard, while the Gilbert Medical Ethics Scholarship had produced a new generation of doctors committed to integrity above profit. In his penthouse office overlooking the River Liffey, Noel reviewed the Foundation's latest reports with his wife, Dr. Sarah Collins Gilbert. Their marriage, built on shared values and mutual respect, had flourished over the past 7 years. She headed the Foundation's research division, her commitment to medical ethics matching his own. The New York Times wants to interview you about the Foundation's 10th anniversary, Sarah mentioned, sliding a tablet across his desk. They're particularly interested in how it started. Noel smiled slightly. They know how it started. That wedding scandal is still required reading in medical ethics courses. Speaking of which, Sarah pulled up another email. Ray's application for the scholarship program arrived this morning. Ray Gilbert, now 29, had spent the past decade working his way up from hospital orderly to licensed practical nurse. His journey from entitled youth to healthcare professional had been slow but genuine, each step earned through honest work, his former arrogance replaced by a genuine commitment to patient care. His supervisor at Boston General wrote quite a recommendation, Sarah noted. Apparently, he uses his own story to teach new staff about medical ethics. Meanwhile, in a modest Manhattan apartment, Bridget Gilbert, Preston no longer, after her society wedding imploded, lived a quiet life. She had eventually married a pharmacy technician, and they resided in Queens, where she worked as a physician's assistant, the highest medical position she could achieve after the scandal destroyed her surgical aspirations. Her attempts to rebuild bridges with the Preston family had failed spectacularly. Blake had married within months of their broken engagement, his new wife now sitting on hospital boards Bridget had once expected to chair. The society pages that had once featured her as Manhattan's medical princess now barely acknowledged her existence. Jillian, now 33, had found an unexpected path after losing her medical school admission. Working as a medical equipment sales representative, she traveled between small clinics, the only facilities that would still do business with a Gilbert. Her social media accounts, once full of mocking posts about Noel, now stayed carefully professional, though the internet never forgot her attempted character assassination. In their respective corners of New York, the former Gilberts received the same email that morning. The Gilbert Medical Ethics Foundation proudly announces its 10th anniversary symposium. Keynote speaker, Dr. Noel Gilbert will present Integrity in Medicine, a Decade of Change. Location, Mount Sinai Hospital, Main Auditorium. The choice of venue wasn't lost on anyone. Mount Sinai, eager to rebuild its reputation after the Knopp scandal, had spent years courting Noel's return. Instead, he'd chosen to use their auditorium for a single day, a reminder of how integrity could triumph over deception. Eduardo, reading the announcement on a public library computer, felt the last threads of his dignity unravel. The symposium would feature case studies of medical fraud, including his own scheme. His name would become a cautionary tale taught to future generations of doctors as an example of ethics abandoned for profit. Lorraine saw the announcement at work, her hands shaking as she filed dental records. The receptionist position barely covered her share of their rent, forcing her to seek side work cleaning medical offices at night. The irony of sanitizing the spaces where she'd once administered care wasn't lost on her. That evening, in their shabby Queens apartment, Eduardo and Lorraine faced another microwave dinner, their conversation as bitter as their instant coffee. Mount Sinai hosting his symposium. Eduardo spat. Those hypocrites. Half their board knew about my special arrangements. At least you're not scrubbing toilets in medical offices, Lorraine retorted. Do you know how many former friends I've run into while cleaning? Women who used to beg me for invitations to my charity events. Their argument was interrupted by a notice slipped under their door. Final eviction warning. Eduardo's settlement payments would leave them virtually penniless. Their love affair, built on deception and maintained by fraud, had led them here, to a roach-infested apartment they couldn't even keep. Across the Atlantic, Noel and Sarah hosted a dinner party in their Dublin penthouse. The guests included leading medical ethicists, researchers, and 2 former Gilbert medical ethics scholars who had exposed significant insurance fraud schemes in their hospitals. Your foundation changed the culture, one guest observed. 10 years ago, doctors looked the other way. Now they speak up. Integrity isn't just about following rules, Noel replied, sharing a knowing look with Sarah. It's about understanding why the rules exist. Every medical decision affects lives beyond the patient in front of us. Later that night, reviewing Ray's scholarship application, Noel read his personal statement. I learned about medical ethics the hard way, by watching my biological father destroy lives through fraud, and my real father build something better from the wreckage. Every time I help a patient, I remember that trust is earned through truth, not convenience. Sarah, reading over his shoulder, squeezed his hand. Are you ready to tell your story at the symposium? It's not just my story anymore, Noel answered. It's become something larger, a lesson about choices and consequences, about turning betrayal into benefit. The symposium proved his point. The Mount Sinai auditorium filled with medical professionals, students, and ethics committees from around the world. In the front row, Ray sat in his nurse's scrubs, representing both what had been lost and what could be rebuilt through honest work. Eduardo and Lorraine weren't present, though they'd received invitations. They spent that day packing their meager belongings, preparing to separate at last. Eduardo had found a room in a retirement home for destitute medical professionals, an institution he'd once mocked. Lorraine would move in with a former nurse, whose life she'd ruined by falsifying records, now working as her elderly mother's caregiver in exchange for a small room. Their great love affair ended not with passion, but with paperwork. Change of address forms, divided bills, separate lives reduced to separate boxes. The deception that had seemed so exciting, so worth every risk, had purchased them a decade of slow dissolution. In the Mount Sinai auditorium, Noel's keynote address drew to a close. Medicine rests on trust, trust between doctor and patient, between colleagues, between institutions and the public they serve. When we breach that trust for personal gain, we don't just deceive individuals, we damage the very foundation of medical care. 10 years ago, a betrayal taught me that lesson. But it also taught me something else. From the ashes of deception, we can build something stronger. Every scholar this foundation has produced, every ethical violation they've exposed, every patient they've protected, these are the real legacy of that moment. Integrity, once broken, commands a price no amount of deception can avoid. But integrity maintained, integrity restored, integrity championed, that builds a legacy that outlasts any personal gain. The standing ovation that followed reached even the hospital's lower floors, where Ray had started his journey as an orderly. In the audience, young medical students who had studied the Knopp case saw its living consequences. The distinguished surgeon who had turned betrayal into benefit, and the son who had chosen truth over pretense. That evening, as Dublin's lights sparkled across the Liffey, Noel and Sarah reviewed applications for the Foundation's next scholarship class. Among them were students who had reported ethical violations in their schools, researchers who had refused to falsify data despite pressure, and healthcare workers who had chosen truth over advancement. In a small box arriving at their office was a contribution to the Foundation's museum, Eduardo's medical license, surrendered after a decade of legal battles. He had sent it with a note. "For your ethics museum. Let them learn from my mistakes." The license would join other artifacts: Lorraine's revoked nursing certificate, clippings from the scandal, and the wedding invitation that had never led to a ceremony. Together, they told a story not just of betrayal, but of its price, and the unexpected ways truth could triumph over deception. In the end, the perfect betrayal had created something its perpetrators never intended: a legacy of integrity that would shape medical ethics for generations to come. While Eduardo and Lorraine's deception purchased them a decade of decline, Noel's truth had built a foundation for the future. And in hospitals across the world, doctors trained in the Gilbert tradition would remember: every medical decision, every ethical choice, carried consequences that reached far beyond the moment of decision. In this way, a personal betrayal had transformed into a professional revolution, proving that the greatest revenge wasn't destruction, but creation, building something so positive from pain that even the pain itself became purposeful. The story of the wedding that wasn't had become required reading in medical schools, not for its scandal, but for its lesson. Integrity, once chosen and maintained, could transform even the deepest betrayal into lasting benefit. In this way, Noel's greatest triumph wasn't surviving deception, but showing others how to prevent it, one ethical decision at a time. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care,